So finally, because you get into rooms we don't get to go, I'm curious if you're hearing anything that's on your radar that you would put on ours, or even if your views coming into 2023 have shifted at all by the events of the last couple of months. What's on your radar right now besides what we have talked about? I know you've got many different topics, AI, etc., but you are generally pretty optimistic about the U.S. economy.
Yeah,
Does
definitely.
that continue to be the case?
Yeah, I think so. Again, cleanest dirty shirt argument, demographics. I mean, China has far greater headwinds than the United States does, and I think that matters.
Yeah.
I guess I would say I'm growing in my concern about the rift between the US and its allies and the global South, the developing world. The level of anger I am hearing when I talk to leaders from emerging markets around the world.
Anger against the U.S.?
Anger about hypocrisy, anger about, you're telling us to support Ukraine, you give $100 billion to Ukraine because they're white people. But what about brown people? You don't care as much about brown. Your revealed preferences on brown people just isn't very impressive. And they saw that with vaccines in the response to the pandemic. They're seeing it now on Russia, Ukraine. They're seeing it on climate change in a big way. And when I think about the need to have global solutions to global problems, coupling the US-China, sort of fireworks on the headlines, and then underneath that, the United States aligned much more with the G7, aligned much more with NATO, but really not aligned at all with all of these developing countries, many of whom are democracies.
Yeah.
But they're like, no, you might say it's democracies versus autocracies, but we don't feel like you mean it. We feel like that's performative. That's not really for us. And I think that's becoming a much bigger challenge in how I look at globalization. Your globalization questions to me were a lot about US versus China. My globalization challenges are much deeper about what happens with the majority of the world's population, who increasingly also aren't big buyers of the way that we've defined globalization for decades.
And that big jump in prosperity we've seen over the past generation is not continuing apace. That's part of the problem.
For them.
Yeah.
And it used to be, I mean, when the American middle class, which is comparatively wealthy in the context of the world,
Sure.
said, no, we're losing our jobs. At that point, you had a growing global middle class that felt very good about globalization trends. The last 3 years, you've had 5 years of reversion to the mean. You've had 5 years of lack of progress for the global middle class, and they're getting angrier, and their governments are under more political pressure. And I mean, if you want to try to get to 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warming as opposed to 2.5 or 3, you can't have that. So we're going to face much greater global costs, and lack of efficiency in politics and geopolitics are going to insert themselves into big business decisions in a way that we're not going to like.
Great. One last question. Any contenders out there, any politicians that are actually recognizing this and you're hearing it in their rhetoric about these risks, or is everybody essentially playing to their own base and it's not being discussed, what you just...
Look, I mean, when I spend time in Washington, so many people understand these things, but that doesn't mean that they're going to drive decisions.
Yeah.
No, and publicly too. I mean, if I think of the last 2 senators I sat down with, Mitt Romney, Chris Coons,
Sure.
different political parties, both completely understand these challenges, but they do not reflect the base of their political parties.
Yeah.
I mean, even seeing on Russia, Ukraine, the difference between what McConnell and McCarthy have been saying that they're literally, when it comes to Russia, they're on Team Biden. It's an extraordinary thing for both of them to say, and yet you won't see Trump saying it, or Pompeo, or DeSantis. They know, right? They know what they're fighting for. So that the fact that the Democrats versus Republicans today are self-sorting in a way that doesn't reflect the population. The population in the United States is a bell curve. Most people in America, on issues like immigration, on issues like abortion, they're in the middle.
Yeah.
And that's the way the Senate plays, but that's not the way gerrymandering plays. That's not the way the House plays. That's not the way cable news plays. That's not the way social media plays. Then you'd think that the United States was hard on left and hard on right. And because that's what drives the money and the eyeballs, that's where the politics are. And so America is, the average American citizen is particularly poorly served by the average American politician. And that is a deep, deep problem we have today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be continued. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
My pleasure.